Well, by training, I studied philosophy and psychology in parallel, so I was always interested in the background assumptions of what a concrete science like psychology assumes. And so I did a PhD in clinical psychology, and I did a PhD in history and theory of science in Vienna. And then I started off with empirical research. I was interested in complementary medicine, various issues. We started off consciousness research in mindfulness in Germany, and I combined that with the reflection about what is the background we are doing. And that's my generic background that brought me to that project, I think. Well, I actually discovered that when I was studying philosophy at UCL here in London in 1980. I came across Robin Collingwood and studied him, and found that very convincing, that idea that there is some sort of background assumption to any human endeavor, even scientific human endeavor, which you cannot support by the very system you are using. So you cannot support science by you doing science. You're doing science and you're making assumptions about science. And later on I discovered that Thomas Kuhn, in his famous work on the structure of scientific revolutions, had actually used Collingwood's thoughts without having acknowledged that. So that was quite an interesting discovery I made. And I just think it's a very fundamental insight in modern philosophy and the modern theory of science, that there is no such thing as an assumption-free science. It's just not possible. And I think that is the very important message, or the most important message of this report, is that we need to look at the assumptions we make with whatever we do, but especially with science. I think there is a rigor which pertains to the actual method of science, like, you know, doing experiments properly, doing controls properly, doing your statistical analysis properly, thinking about confounders. But there is also a rigor to the background assumptions and the reflections on why you're doing this and what are the assumptions you are making, and are those assumptions correct? Well, I think those major limitations of science are quite obvious. They are the implicit assumption that materialism as a philosophical worldview is correct. And I don't think there is any reason to assume that this is true. What happened historically is that science emerged and evolved from the study of material systems, and then just neglected everything else. But that doesn't mean that material systems are the only thing in the world, and therefore science has tried to come up with a theory of consciousness that is based on material systems, which I don't think is either warranted nor proven. Well, the materialist understanding of the relationship between brain and consciousness is that the brain produces consciousness similar to the liver producing gall, right? But I don't think that this is a very well-justified assumption. It's an assumption, and it is an assumption we've been going along ever since physiology tried to deal with that problem, and that is certainly back in 1850, for instance, in Berlin. And we haven't come closer to the solution of the problem. So I don't think it's a very good research project. I mean, it's a research project you can follow, of course, but I think it should not be the only research project. I think one way of seeing them addressed is by a stronger rigor about the reflections about the assumptions. That would be very helpful, because then people would maybe understand that they are making this assumption, and maybe the assumption is true, maybe it's not true. That would be one way of doing that. And another way of doing that would be opening up the arena a little bit more for alternative ways of looking at things. I think the problem that is arising out of those limitations is that young researchers, PhD students, postdocs are being funneled into that view, and everybody is just trying to go through that little funnel hole to find a solution to the consciousness problem. And I think that's just not very clever. I think we should have different ways of looking at things, multi-perspectively, as it were. I think there is empirical evidence, and then there is theoretical arguments. I think empirical evidence is probably only as good as your theoretical fluidity goes, because we are all Bayesians, right? So we start from assumptions, and empirical evidence we take to either refute or support our assumptions. And most people have very strong assumptions about materialism being true. So for them, the evidence will only be maybe a little nick in their worldview. But I think it's pretty clear that we have evidence on potential self-contained or self-subsistent consciousness in those cases I mentioned in the report of near-death experiences where people were seemingly conscious about events that were not even locally present. They were distant locally present. And I've referenced that work by Titus Rivas that has collected 100 cases from the literature that support this, quite well evidenced, I find. And you can, of course, say, well, maybe there is one case that is wrong or 10 cases that is wrong, but maybe not all 100 cases. And then there is evidence from the parapsychological database, which I think is actually taken together quite strong. And then I mentioned the reincarnation cases of children that Ian Stevenson and Erlindur Haraldsson have researched on for many decades, where you could also say this case might be weak, this case might be weak, but all of them together I don't think you can discard. So what applies is the faggot argument that William James made when he was president of the SPR, I think in 1870 something. Or 81, I forgot. A little bit later. But anyway, the faggot argument, which goes, you can take any stick out of a faggot and break it easily. That's not a problem. But you cannot break the faggot as a whole. And I think the same applies to the evidence which I've accumulated here, and that would be the empirical evidence. I think it is very important that empirical evidence is being looked at naively, as it were, without the theoretical preconceptions, or at least for the time being say, what if I didn't have those theoretical preconceptions? What would I make of that? Yes. And then I think it would become pretty clear that one should look at this evidence even though we do not know how to understand it. Because animalistic data, to call it that in a very generic term, from a theory of science point of view, always has the role of pointing out where our current theory making and our current scientific thinking is not adequate to the phenomena. And therefore I think people should look at those data, even though they don't like looking at those data, and try to understand what would a worldview have to be like to incorporate those data. Most people don't even go that far and say, I'm looking at those data. They just say, that can't be right. I read a commentary on Ethel Cardenia's piece in the American Psychological Association journal, Psychology Today, I think it was, or American Psychologist, saying pigs don't fly, so you don't have to study flying pigs. Yes. But that's a wrong analogy, because here we have actually flying pigs. So what does make pigs fly? That would be the question. Well, in the report, I have tried to tread a middle ground and offer something that is maybe reconcilable even to a materialist view of the world. And that would be a complementarist view, saying, well, consciousness and material systems are two different theoretical realms. They are two different categories, so we cannot reduce one to the other. Neither way, neither material entities to consciousness nor the other way around. So we have to go along with the idea that these are two complementary sides of reality that we experience. And I call this a minimal consensus model, because I think that is what you need to minimally agree on in order to take consciousness seriously. But I'm not saying this is the only way how you could look at it. I myself am a little bit uncommitted, I must say. I'm not sure what is true. I'm sure we need to give a stronger credence and stronger scientific position to consciousness, that it might also be true that it turns out that there is some different reality beyond consciousness that appears to us in two modes, material entities and consciousness, because that is just how we are constructed. Suppose you are an entity that is not bound to that world, you might be able to see some different realities which we can't, because this is just how we are constructed. So maybe the Jamesian, William James's analogy that consciousness or the brain is a kind of filter that funnels or filters consciousness and makes it available to us would be a good analogy, and that would certainly mean that there are two streams or strands of reality, that you cannot reduce one to the other. And how to make that work, I don't know. That is certainly the experiential reality of those mystical or unification or enlightenment experiences, however you want to call it. And therefore, I think we should at least phenomenologically take consciousness as serious as we take matter.
Yes.
And we haven't done that in our science so far. There is a very clear consequence from all that, and that consequence is that we need to take a conscious experience more seriously as a potential source of knowledge. So that would lead into a kind of contemplative type of science, which, by the way, is actually already happening. So there is a strand of research that calls itself contemplative neuroscience, where people are looking at brain events, for instance with brain scanners or high-resolution EEG, and at the same time they are asking people, what are you actually experiencing? And so it's a kind of methodologically refined introspection, as you do, for instance, when you have a contemplative training or a meditative training. We should not forget there was a long history of introspective science, I would call it, introspective scholarship, we might also say, in ancient India, in the Buddhist and Hindu psychologies. They are based on introspective knowledge, and we discard that. We go about as if it didn't even exist. And I'm not knowledgeable enough to say anything about that, but I think we should probably both look into those older texts and combine that with modern methodology of refined introspection, which we don't have. And I think Alan Wallace has a very good point there, because we need at least as honed a methodology for methodological introspection as we have developed for experimentation. I mean, you can't just take a person off the street and say, do this physics experiment. They wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, they need 5 years of studies at least, plus PhD work, plus postdoc work, until they can actually do a proper physics experiment. And in the same sense, you can't just take any psychology student and say, sit down, introspect and tell me what is happening.
Yes.
So we need a methodology to hone in on those introspective capacities which we do have, but which we need to develop. And we don't have any methodology for that, not in our Western scientific model.
So that's part of the agenda.
I think that would be part of the agenda, at least acknowledging that we need that. And maybe in some departments that feel dedicated to that, do that and try to develop that. There are very few people who are actually already doing that, and this could be expanded, you know, into a scientific branch, as it were, similar to experimenting in physics, in psychology, in other areas, biology. I'm not sure how this is possible because, as I said, humans are Bayesians, so they are being trained in a certain worldview, and that is being supported by whatever they do, and whatever comes across their way which doesn't fit, they tend to block out. So people run around with blinkers because that is how we deal with our limited resources. So what needs to be done is just a lot of communication, talking to people, spreading the word, repeating things. I always tell my students science is 80% hypnotherapy. So you repeat things, you repeat things, you repeat things, you repeat things, and suddenly they become true.
Yes.
So we need communication, repetition, information. there is one neglected issue here which we need to address, and that is the issue about religion and science. Because, as you know, science has developed its own ways, not only but also in opposition to official Christian dogma in the West. And there are many people who think that we need to protect this scientific space of autonomy, of own methodology not being meddled with by religious authorities. And whenever you talk about things like, say, near-death experiences or parapsychological database, they fear that this is coming religion through the back door. And I think that needs to be excluded, because I think also religion needs to have a more enlightened view about the world. There is very little contact between say, evolutionary theory and Christian theology. And therefore we need, I think, communications in both ways in order to make it possible for scientists to understand, looking at parapsychological data, looking at reincarnation experiences cases, looking at non-local perception in near-death experiences, doesn't mean buying into a religion, and doesn't mean opening the back door for religious dogma to come back into science, because that's not going to happen.
No, not at all.
I think spirituality is a key word here, because it means we are taking human experience seriously. And experience, after all, is the basis for any science. Outer experience, as it were, perception and amplification of our experiences through scientific machinery is the basic of empirical science. And so is inner experience of, say, an enlightenment experience, or an experience of unity with nature, or a religious experience, or whatever it is. I mean, experience is the raw material of any science. I mean, it's quite interesting to see that when you look into the history of Western science, you very quickly end up in the 13th century with one very important figure, Roger Bacon, who was a Franciscan friar and also a scientist, one of the first people who did optical experiments in Oxford and built astrolabes and other scientific instruments. And in 1267 he wrote a book on demand for the Pope, how he would envisage future science to be. And he said, well, any science needs to be based on experience, and experience comes in two ways. It comes in outer experience, as outer experience, meaning sense experience, experience of material things, and it comes in the way of inner experience. And he uses the terminology that he had available at the time, which is Franciscan mystical theology. But you can just take it and say, well, this was actually an understanding that we have two branches of experience, even at the root of scientific development. One branch developed into science, into empirical science. The other branch did not develop at all. It went further in mystical thinkers and writers such as Meister Eckhart and others, but it didn't develop into a science. It didn't even develop into a proper theology. It was just a kind of theological backstream or downstream effort. And I think it's time to realize that these have to come together. I think the evidence base needs to be expanded and the methodology needs to be expanded. Because we've had about 500 years time to hone into an experimental methodology for empirical science, and we are now at a place where we think we know how to do experiments properly, and the combination of experiments and theory, but we have had nothing comparable in terms of inner empiricism. How do you hone in on that methodology? And it's even more complicated, because with empiricism of the senses, you have an outer reference. We have a glass here, which we can both agree on somehow, and we can analyze somehow. If I have an experience of unity with, say, nature, we don't have the same type of referent here. We need to discuss it. We need to put the information experience into language, and then there is a lot of distortion. So we have to discuss a lot more processes in that respect, and we do not have a good methodology for that. I think it would have a great impact, because after all, science, modern science is one of the greatest drivers of the grand narratives of our world. And we always live on grand narratives, on big stories. And the current big story is the evolutionary story, that everything came out of nothing by accident, by evolution. And that may be a true narrative, but it leaves out consciousness. And if we bring consciousness back into that story to some degree and at some point, then I think the rampant materialism that we are seeing today, both in economy and in the way how we develop our world and how we actually ruin it, would probably change. And so I think a different view on science would also engender a different view on how we deal with our world, I would think. And we would not be thinking that accumulating riches is the purpose of life, as it seems to be for at least some people. And these very few people create a lot of problems for the rest of us and for the planet, I think. And so I think a different view on what it is the world is made of will also engender a different culture at large, a culture of producing, a culture of consuming, and a different ethics of both.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
If there's any other points that you'd like to make? We've covered quite a lot of ground, I think.
Can I make one last statement?
Yes, absolutely.
I also think that inner experience is the source of ethics. Science has nothing to say whatsoever on ethics. I mean, there is some attempt to reconstruct ethics from an evolutionary understanding, but that is just an understanding, how did it come about? But what should we do in the future cannot be reconstructed from understanding the material workings of our world. We need another source. And currently the only source we have is, as you, David, called it, the living off the capital of previous times, right? Because religion installed ethics. Now we don't have any source of it, so we would have only political bargaining to assure ethics. And as we see in the world every day, political bargaining is not a very robust method of assuring ethics, I think. But ethics is, I think, the result of a proper experience of the world from within, the relationships, the connectedness with nature, with other human beings. And therefore I think it is also a way of scientifically addressing the question, what would a proper ethics be like? You could also see the historical development of the ethical injunctions that religions make as a result of the experience of their founders. So if you look at the story of Moses coming down from the mountain with the tablets, right? That is an image of producing ethical prescriptions from a deep inner understanding or a deep experience of what would have been the divine.